This is a Bergen Film Club podcast.
Like an old movie removed from the frame, I am floating and looking for someone to blame. Won't you project me on the walls of your heart? I'm waiting for the real thing to start.
Hello, welcome back to The Real Thing. I'm your host, Joe Lawrence. Here we go, podcast. This podcast is an extension of Bergen Film Club, which is an independent cinema in Bergen, Norway, where we try to show films that deserve to be shown, spotlighted a bit, give a voice to those who deserve it, and show very good films, most importantly. And on this podcast, I talk about those films, either by myself or with a guest, to say why we chose it or their relation to the film, etc., etc. Today I am on my own, and we're going to be talking about a very special film that has a very deep and rich history around it, or all the context of the film has a very deep and rich history. So that's what I'm going to be doing today, is kind of giving a background to the film production, its director, its lead actress specifically, and then also diving into kind of the history and the allegory of the film in a way, because there's so much. I think that it's possible to get a lot more out of the film after knowing this information. I will say that some of the topics, it gets a bit heavy towards the end, so just letting you know, listener, that we're going to be talking about some heavy topics today, particularly genocide, etc. So let's get into the episode. Today we are talking about the 2009 Peruvian Spanish film The Milk of Sorrow. So, The Milk of Sorrow, or La Teta Asustada, is a Peruvian Spanish film directed and written, produced by Claudia Llosa, and stars Magali Solia. It won the Golden Bear Award, which is the highest award at the Berlin International Film Festival, and was the first Peruvian film to be nominated for the Best Foreign Picture at the 82nd Academy Awards. And just wanted to note that out of the 15 awards that it was nominated for in its entire run, it won 12. There wasn't so much to say about Magali Solia because of what I was looking for, but she is in fact an indigenous Peruvian person. She is born to a Quechua family, speaks frequently of the importance of supporting indigenous languages, traditions, and culture that she aims to kind of advocate through her work as an actress. She's similarly also a celebrated singer, performing often in indigenous languages, and in 2017 she was declared the Artist of Peace by UNESCO. So she plays the lead character Fausta, who we follow during The Milk of Sorrow. It is said that she is suffering from a rare disease, the milk of sorrow, which is a rare disease which is transmitted through the breasts of women who were abused or raped during and after their pregnancy. While living in constant fear and confusion of her illness, her mother suddenly passes away. The choices she makes in her life are due to her desire to not follow in her mother's footsteps. The article Short Takes by Chris Chang calls it a poetic allusion to the aftermath of rape and the way in which trauma can be passed through generations, which is kind of the context that we'll come to talk about in some minutes now. That unfortunately the Peruvian people, and especially indigenous people of Peru, have been subjected to years decades and decades of persecution and terrorism and government oppression, and it's really just feels like it's one thing after another, which I'll explain later. But that's kind of the reference. The frame of reference for this film is these conflicts, particularly that of the Shining Path. Most of the filming was done in Manche, which is a suburban area of Pachacamac, southeast of Lima, which is the capital city of Peru, which indigenous people took over during the 1980s, this Manche area, to escape terrorism, and the rest of the film was filmed in the more affluent area of Lima called Guilla. I don't speak Spanish, just heads up. If I'm pronouncing any of these names wrong, Spanish or Portuguese, then I'm sorry. The film was largely well received, with people often praising the director Llosa's use of abstract visuals to discuss difficult and abstract themes. So Claudia Llosa, who is the director of this film, is a celebrated Peruvian film director, writer, producer, and author, most notably known for her work of this movie, The Milk of Sorrow. Born in Lima in 1976, she studied film direction at the university there. She moved to Madrid in the late 1990s, where she studied at the Film Academy Escuela, TAI. During this time, she completed the script for her first movie, Made in USA, a film which received critical acclaim but was subject to intense debate, suggesting its reinforcement of racial stereotypes of indigenous people, and rather that her middle-class upbringing would mean she was appropriating a culture more marginalized than she, which the article describes as cultural dyslexia. And I pulled that from the article named Cultural Dyslexia and the Political of Cross-Cultural Excursion in Claudia Llosa's Made in USA by Diana Palaversic. The film also stars Magali Solia as the lead, who supported the movie, plus many residents of the town included in the film described the film as a post-colonial feminist narrative that subverts traditional expectations of the colonizer and the colonized. I think that brings up a really good point, especially when we're discussing films that kind of look into marginalized communities, and it's not necessarily from their perspective. This film, Made in USA, and The Milk of Sorrow, for example, some people criticize Llosa for her kind of depiction of the life there, and that no matter how hard she may work to kind of try and represent it correctly, she'll never like truly understand what it's like to be that marginalized or that oppressed, because she grew up in like a semi-affluent area in Peru. And I think that speaks to larger like kind of this idea that there can be a baseline misunderstanding in a way if it's a male director making a movie about a woman, or any director who's not part of a marginalized community making a film about a marginalized community. So like coming to mind is when we talked about The White Reindeer a couple episodes ago, or I recently just watched the Alex Garland movie Men, and that's really criticized because it feels like it can feel tone deaf in a way if you kind of allow it to be tone deaf. If you look at the perspective of it being made by a man, the movie is about a woman's experience of men. So there's a lot to kind of discuss and look at there. And I think it's important to bring in context like this, because I'm not personally criticizing the director, but I can see where a lot of these people come from when they make a criticism like this. And it's like, where does it lie? Like, should no one make movies like this, or should we be allowed to kind of observe and look at these things from the outside? Because the point of the fact is that we don't give a voice to the community itself through doing films like this. Again, with when we talked about Sami film, for example, like that new wave of Sami films being made now by actual Sami indigenous people, that brings a new wave, and we get to like observe that culture from people who actively experience it in a way that like does that discredit the movies that were made before that were not made by Sami people but still maybe reflected the community well. I think that's very applicable here as well. And I'm not trying to answer that right now. I'm just bringing up the kind of thought process around this when I was doing the reading for it. The Milk of Sorrow was better received with many considering this film a tasteful view on the generational atrocities faced by the indigenous people of Peru. Since then, Claudia has made El Niño Pepita, Loxoro and Aloft, and most recently Fever Dream. So concerning the criticism Llosa has faced of her depiction of indigenous people, in the article New Configurations for Peruvian Cinema, The Rising Star of Claudia Llosa by Sarah Barrow, Barrow suggests that she is not in fact depicting the community themselves, but rather focusing on the harshness and the difficulties faced by indigenous people, particularly the Quechua people, who have a total population of around 8 to 9 million, most living in Peru and other parts of South America. That is seemingly another example of Western audiences widely accepting and praising films that are not necessarily so accepted in their native communities. And I think that the point that the article is making there, or at least from what I understood, is we as the West general can look upon films like that kind of come to us in this package, and with the limited information that we have about the history of Peru, for example, it's definitely something that I didn't know a lot about before. After watching this film and before researching it, if you don't have the context, you can kind of just accept it as face value and think that it's like a good depiction. But I think what the article was saying is not necessarily that her depiction of the indigenous people is bad, but rather that it's not a depiction at all, and rather that it's talking about or considering the themes of the atrocities in a way, if that makes sense. It's more a discussion about what they go through, not the people themselves. That it's not looking at the culture, it's not saying how they live their lives or the customs that they follow or their language. It's more so this is what they have been through, and then this narrative that she creates in The Milk of Sorrow, which is based on this folk story, is how she talks about it without explicitly talking about the community itself. But that's kind of the gist of that, and I really recommend the movie. I think it does kind of, if you kind of just again take it at face value of just it being a story, it's very emotional and poignant and beautiful, incredibly well acted by Magali Solia, and just a narrative of trying to heal from trauma that's passed down through generations, and trying to end that cycle of hatred and sadness and pain. Or is what the character is trying to do, is kind of shed off that thing that she's inherited from her mother in a way. And then when you can look at it from a deeper perspective with more information, then I think it's good. It is a good, for me personally, I think it does reflect not necessarily the events themselves, but the aftermath and the pain that people still feel to this day. I think that it discusses that quite well. Rather this aftermath, rather than the actual explicit atrocities themselves. So yeah, watch the movie. This episode is coming out on the 26th, and I believe that we're showing it on the 28th of February 2024. So if you're around and want to watch it, then come to the film club, and I hope that you'll enjoy it. I am going to talk a bit about what I guess I just kind of generally calling the Peruvian conflict, and specifically about the shining path, and this notion. This is really horrible, so just again get ready. This notion of forced sterilization, and also kind of where it sort of sits today in the present day, what's happening with the treatment of indigenous people, and also just the Peruvian people in general. So yeah, buckle up, it's history time. So we're talking about the Shining Path. I'm referring to the Shining Path insurgency in Peru, which is led by Abimel Guzman, unfolded between the early 1980s and the late 1990s, marking one of the darkest chapters in the country's history. This is a Maoist guerrilla group sought to establish a community state through armed struggle, and their campaign of violence had devastating consequences on and for indigenous communities. So the Shining Path is a breakaway faction of the Peruvian Communist Party, or the PCP, and it broke off in 1970. It was led by this man, Abimael Guzman, who started life as a philosophy professor at the University of Ayacucho, who, after visiting China and being particularly inspired by the ideas of Mao Zedong, decided to form this group with the idea of uniting Peru through waging a popular war, which is a Maoist strategy, which in essence means bringing the militia of the enemy deep within the countryside. By the 1980s, the group had grown to more than 500 members, and at its peak it had around 3,000, all more or less actively fighting on the front line. They periodically carried out attacks on police stations, communities, indigenous villages, and specifically ballot boxes before elections, particularly pressuring the indigenous communities to not vote or vote for who they wanted to. One of the most infamous incidents was the massacre of the town of Luca na Marca in 1983. Shining Path militants attacked the indigenous community, accusing them of being sympathetic to the rival leftist group. The militants brutally killed around 69 men, women, and children, leaving a trail of carnage that shocked the nation. The Shining Path was notorious for its brutal tactics, targeting not only government forces but also in these indigenous populations that they perceived as collaborators or rivals of themselves. In many cases, they coerced indigenous communities into supporting their cause through intimidation and violence, and villagers were often caught in the crossfire between the Shining Path and government forces, leading to widespread displacement and loss of life. This idea of this people's war, of bringing the fight into an area where they feel like they have more dominance, taking the government militia away from the big cities, kind of put the indigenous people into this war totally against their will. Beyond direct violence, the Shining Path disrupted traditional indigenous ways of life. They imposed strict control over local populations, restricting cultural practices and communal activities. Indigenous people faced coercion to conform to Shining Path's ideology, and eroded the rich cultural tapestry of these communities and their languages. The internal conflict has had a profound and lasting effect on Peru. The scars of the Shining Path insurgency are still visible in the social and economic fabric of the country. The trauma experienced by these communities, the indigenous communities, during this period continues to impact their well-being, contributing to ongoing challenges in the pursuit of justice, reconciliation, and the restoration of indigenous rights in contemporary Peru. The tide of the war changed when Alberto Fujimori took office in 1990 and launched an assault on the rebels, squeezing out the last remaining efforts of the Shining Path. But unfortunately, this was just not the beginning, but a continuation of oppression of the indigenous communities, which is why I'm coming to the forced sterilization of the indigenous people. The forced sterilization of the indigenous people in Peru is another dark chapter in the country's recent history, occurring primarily during the 1990s under the government of the President Alberto Fujimori. The sterilization campaign was presented as part of a broader family planning program to limit the population growth, but was later revealed to involve coercive and often brutal methods disproportionately affecting indigenous and rural populations, specifically women. Between 1996 and 2000, an estimated 300,000 women and 22,000 men, many of whom were indigenous, were subjected to sterilization without their informed consent. The government, driven by a desire to control the growth of the population, targeted vulnerable and marginalized community, particularly those in rural areas. Health workers, often under pressure to meet sterilization quotas, resorted to unethical practices such as misleading women about the nature of procedures, performing surgeries without proper medical standards, and even engaging in outright coercion. Indigenous women who had limited access to information and healthcare were particularly vulnerable to these abuses. The consequences of the forced sterilization campaign were profound and extended beyond the immediate and physical and psychological trauma experienced by these individuals. Many women suffered long-term health issues, and the social fabric of the affected communities was deeply impacted. The campaign exacerbated existing inequalities and discrimination faced by the indigenous populations in Peru, violating their reproductive rights and autonomy. In the aftermath of this event, there has been ongoing advocacy for justice and reparations. Victims and human rights organizations have called for accountability for those responsible for orchestrating and implementing the sterilization campaign. While some legal proceedings have taken place, many argue that more needs to be done to address the lasting effects of this period in Peru's history and to ensure the protection of reproductive rights for all, with a particular focus on marginalized communities. Unfortunately, the Shining Path is the last remnant of Peru's guerrilla movement from the end of the 20th century, has unfortunately come back into the fold. Although it's in decline, it still remains a strong influence over this large area of Peru due to its drug trafficking alliances and also secret alliances with the government. On May 23rd, 2021, a splinter group of the Shining Path reportedly killed 16 people in this area and left behind pamphlets warning people not to vote in the presidential elections scheduled for June 6th, and especially not to vote for the right-wing candidate Keiko Fujimori. Since then, the indigenous oppression, unfortunately, continues, whether it is through this new splinter group of the Shining Path or whether it's literally government oppression itself. A few years ago, 2 female governmental candidates tried to swear into the government speaking their indigenous language, and the present Prime Minister of Peru told them that it didn't count because they weren't speaking Portuguese. And that is the horrible tale and persisting ongoing story of indigenous oppression in Peru that is provided a small context with through The Milk of Sorrow. It's a really awful thing to be known about, I think. I found it very upsetting to read about, and this, whether it's just outright oppression or literally killing these marginalized communities, there is just so much oppression and hatred to indigenous communities within Peru. It's obviously a country that experiences a large amount of conflict to this day. I kind of don't know how to wrap this episode up, but it is incredibly sad, and I encourage people to see this movie, obviously, but like I said, I don't know necessarily that it talks so much about the community themselves, but there are a lot of articles out there, and I'll link to everything that I read in this episode in the show notes, so if people want to read more about these communities and how wonderful they are, then you can do that, and also learn a bit more about the insurgency itself, which is really awful. But I think that it is obviously important to know and educate ourselves as kind of very comfortable Westerners. Like, I'm sitting here in Norway, very, very safe country, just sitting in my bedroom reading information off my laptop screen. So it's important for us to know and educate ourselves as well as we can about these genocides that are happening all over the world, consistently and all the time. Yeah. God. But I hope that you were able to kind of like learn something and observe something through the film if you do go see it, or just rather just having learned about this conflict itself is something that I also think is quite important to know about. But yeah, a little bit of a short episode, but a lot of information there, and yeah, we'll be back on Thursday with our standard recommendation episodes, and yeah, got some really cool episodes coming up in the future. And yeah, I know it's like tough to listen to stuff like this, but like I said, it's important to know about it, and it's important to But thank you very much for listening. I have been your host, Joe Lawrence. Goodbye. This has been a Bergen Film Club production. Our music is by Wise John. Check them out on Instagram at WISEJohnOfficial. Our logo is by Pia Sofia Brentersen. This episode was produced, mixed and engineered by Joe Lawrence. Our researchers are Inke Shilbreiben and Mamina Nazmajid. Want to talk to us about films? then please send us an email at podcast@bergenfilmclub.com. Follow the show on Instagram and Twitter at TheRealThingPod. Check us out on Letterboxd at BFK The Real Thing. Thank you and goodbye. Listen, follow, leave us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Podcasts, or wherever it is that you get your podcasts.